Please understand that this is not who I am any longer. It's not the way I currently think or feel. What you're about to read is an unadulterated insight into how the USMC operates. It's how they make 18 to 19-year-old kids do what most adults couldn't comprehend doing. That being said, it's important other people learn so that maybe the stigma of mental health issues surrounding our veterans ends, and hopefully sooner rather than later. I joined the USMC officially on June 11th of 2007, so I missed a lot of the really ugly stuff they saw during the initial war with Iraq/Afghanistan. However, that being said, I still saw more than my fair share of things that left me completely and utterly spent. I justified all of my actions as a case of, if I don't do this, then this will be done to me, even though looking back on it, I'm not really sure I believe that any longer. I don't know that I ever did. But I told myself that to protect myself from taking responsibility for my actions. When we deployed to Iraq, I was stationed near a town called Ramadi. At the time, I called it a complete crap hole. Today, looking back, it's not much different to where I live now. People just going about their lives wanting to be left alone, wanting to have the same things we want: food, water, and a safe place to live. Those things we often take for granted. These people didn't. They didn't know when we were going to kick down their door on some tip from some scared family who we had threatened with imprisonment and torture not before long. So many times these tips went without a solid lead. I just remember one that sticks out as being actually accurate. We were told this guy was an explosives manufacturer and had a weapon stashed under his floor. We were told to expect resistance going in, and we were told the same stuff we were always told when we hit a house. What we weren't told was to expect children. Expect children with AK-47s and other assorted weapons waiting for us inside the house. When we went in, screaming to get down, all these little kids, babies effectively. I have children now that were older than these kids. Initially, they did nothing. They looked at us, they weren't scared of us, but they were scared when we told one to drop his weapon. He raised it at us before he could pull the trigger, and you can imagine what we had to do. The rest dropped theirs and cried on the floor. We had just proven what every evil adult had told these kids to be true, that we were the bogeymen. To this day I remember his eyes. I remember how he was so scared and confused. We cleared the house and got the dude making the explosives, but I never felt like it was a successful run. I felt awful. To this day, every time I close my eyes, I see his. I've prayed so many times for those eyes to stop haunting me. I've had my Instagram for about 5 years. I post pretty simple photos, ones of me, and I'm a photographer and artist, so a good amount of pictures that I take as well. I don't have a large following on Instagram, so considering this started about 4 years ago, I probably had around 2,000 followers, and most of them were friends, family, or friends of friends. One day I posted a screenshot on my private Instagram of someone randomly viewing my story. I'm not sure what the context was, but it doesn't really matter. Soon after, a friend of mine pointed out that one of the Instagram accounts that was viewing my story had a profile picture that was a photo of my friend, so I immediately went to their account. I noticed that all of their pictures were once screenshotted from my account, and I immediately began freaking out. They went by a kind of Russianized version of my name and had about 1,000 followers. I was baffled. This account didn't last that long. and was receiving probably more activity than my own. I was confused, but I also knew that that was what happens when you have a public Instagram, and some catfish isn't going to ruin my life, so I reported it and moved on. Soon after, I started getting messages from random Instagram accounts that all seemed to be coming from Russia. They would send me messages and screenshots of different accounts that also all seemed to be in Russian, of people pretending to be me. I started to panic more, and I knew that not only was it not just one person, but that many people knew about it, and genuinely thought that I was a completely different person than I was. I kept reporting these accounts, and they would mysteriously delete and then show up again under new names. But at this point, my Instagram account was blocked by pretty much all of the catfish accounts. I logged into a friend's Instagram. I noticed tagged photos of the catfish of me. Drawings. Many drawings. People drawing me, who they totally thought was some random Russian girl. There was a Twitter account, a YouTube account, a VK, which is a Russian-based social media account, a Facebook account, all under this fake name and using pictures of me. I finally got a lot of fake accounts to be deleted and felt relieved. Then, probably about 6 months later, I got another message on Instagram for some other random Russian account sending me to yet another fake profile pretending to be from me. The first thing that stuck out to me was the fact that they had a photo of my mum from when I was a baby. A photo that was only available on my mum's Facebook, which was not public. I panicked, reported the account, and told all of my friends to do the same. Then I got curious. I started wondering who these people were, and where they were finding these accounts. I went deep back into my Instagram DMs, and found that these accounts were also now catfishes of me. I don't know what part of me thought that it would be a good idea to message them, but I did, and I ended up having a very long conversation with them. What they told me was that they used the photos of me because I looked like them, and they were very self-conscious. They even said that they show their family photos of me and pretend it's them. One day, I tried to log into my Instagram, and it said something in Russian, that someone had made numerous attempts to reach my password. It was insane. Basically, I'll save the time and effort and say that this went on for another 3 years, happening randomly every 6 months. Finally, there was one account made using my own name. I was so furious and had completely given up, and a few of my friends messaged them and told them to delete the account. They then DM'd me, apologized in broken English, and then decided that they were going to turn their account into a fan page. Again, not super weird. I even got to a point where I was considering calling up the producers of Catfish or something, literally anything. The fan page was running for about 3 months, but it seemed to me that they had deleted it. I still get weird messages from Russian accounts that seem too similar to the others, but I don't feel freaked out by it anymore. This whole situation sucks because I was never directly threatened or put in a situation in which I felt like my life was in danger, so I couldn't go to the police. But there were definitely times when I felt like I was being watched too closely, or for someone who was not famous or anything near it. Not really sure how to end this, because it may never do it, but I hope to never meet you again. This happened my junior year of high school. One of my best friends invited me to a Halloween party at her house with our school friends and some of her friends from her previous school. When I got there, I was wearing a poor iteration of Tom Cruise in Top Gun. My friend introduced me to this girl, and we actually hit it off really well. She told me that my friend had told her a lot about me, and that they knew each other through their parents' work. We started talking about our interests, and were decently flirting with each other. Now I had gotten out of my first real relationship earlier that year, and I was not one to hop around from girl to girl. So being really flirty with someone on my first time meeting them was not something I was used to doing. At the end of the night, we were sitting in the ground floor of my friend's house, and we ended up kissing a little bit, which again was moving really fast for me. We started texting after that, but I kind of had a weird feeling about her and couldn't really see myself being in a relationship with her. But prior to realizing that, we had made plans for a date with my friend, who threw the party, and her boyfriend. When the day of the date came, I had come down with an 101.7 degree fever and felt very out of it. I called her to explain that I was sick and was extremely sorry, but I wouldn't be able to make the date. This was a solid 3 to 4 hours before we were supposed to meet, so I wasn't pulling out last minute. Her response kicked off most of the backward period of my high school life. She responded by saying, "Well, I wasn't going to tell you this earlier, but I have brain cancer, so I don't have much time to go on dates." The strangest part was she asked me not to tell anyone about it. She stated that this was because her father didn't want to use her cancer as a way to work people over to get stuff, which I found odd. Now, a little backstory. I had a football coach who had passed away from cancer, and my friend's mum, the friend who threw the party actually, also developed cancer around that time. So the topic of cancer was heavy on my heart, and I felt incredible guilt. And being the emotionally charged person I am, I decided to go on the date. During the date, she started saying that she really appreciated me coming and the way that I treated her. This made me feel better knowing that I was helping. At a point near the end of the date, we were walking towards my car when she again brought up that she appreciated the way I treat her. She followed it up by explaining that she wasn't used to guys treating her right because she was assaulted when she was younger and actually had to terminate a forced pregnancy at the hand of a male relative of hers. My heart broke for her as she sounded like she had endured a lot of hardship, on top of the fact that she was going to supposedly pass away next year. I was an emotional wreck following the date, because it was a lot for me to take in, but I knew that if all of a sudden I stopped talking to her, I would never forgive myself. At this point, I had a small sense of suspicion of things that she had told me, especially the part about not telling anyone under any circumstances. That coupled with a few other things she said to me on our date, regarding what she wanted to do with her future, saying things like, "I want to try out this hairstyle when I get older." After she said these things, she seemed to tense up a bit, but I chalked it up to her coming to terms with the fact that she'd never be able to do them. My suspicions grew and grew, and eventually I decided to do some investigating. Her father was a doctor at the place where I went for doctor things, and my personal doctor was a family friend of mine who knew her father well. I asked her if there was anything I could do to support or help her regarding her cancer. My doctor looked at me and said, "What cancer? She doesn't have cancer." I immediately became filled with anger and texted her telling her what I had learned. A day before, she had called me to let me know that her diagnosis was a mistake, but her tone was very melodramatic and not at all what I would expect as a response to finding out you didn't have a mortal disease. She tried to cover her tracks and was asking me why I would question her and saying, "I thought you cared about me." I was livid. I blocked her on everything and blocked her number. I also fall into a pretty deep depression for the next week or two because of how much I was yanked about by this girl, and this interaction led me to have major trust issues with women, which I have still not gotten over. A few weeks later, I get a Facebook Messenger request from a name I didn't recognize. It was her. She had made up a fake profile and was telling me I was being super immature and told me that she had some explaining to do. I of course didn't answer, and that was the last I heard of her, until a year and a half later. I had signed up for an ACT retake exam at my local university, and when I got there and sat down, I looked in front of me about 3 seats to the right and she was there. We ended up talking and she apologized for everything she did in a relatively believable manner, and I forgave her. I never found out any of the other things she had told me about her home life, if they were true or not, and I made sure to avoid her at all costs, which was a pain because she worked at a cold stone that was 2 minutes away from my house, and I had to go to the one downtown, which was annoying. I came across her real Facebook profile recently, as well as she seems to be doing well, which I'm glad to see. But as far as our interactions go, let's not meet again. I was in the British Army and stayed over a weekend on a course as it was too far to travel home. The camp was dead, 12 people in total. I was the only person in the female block, which was joined to an old building that was used as a morgue. The upstairs was blocked off, empty, and had a huge heavy padlock and chain. The first night I was awoken by what sounded like footsteps and beds being dragged above me. I checked the parts of the building that I could get into, and there were no signs of anyone. The following morning, I was startled to see a middle-aged woman in the corridor, and I said hi and assumed she must be a cleaner. I nipped to the loo where there were no doors to the bathrooms, and the toilet cubicle was pretty much open so I could hear everything there. There was only silence and me peeing. I washed my hands and then ran across the corridor to grab my wash kit and realized the woman had gone. I looked around and there was no sign of her, yet the 2 large heavy fire doors to the exit building had not made a sound. I found out on Monday that only one person had access to the upstairs and no one had been up in years. Civvy staff didn't enter the camp on weekends, plus they needed keys for buildings, and when I described the woman, none of the permanent staff knew of her as it was a small camp. Apparently everyone who stayed in the building had reported strange things. I broke up with my long-term girlfriend not too long ago, and that is what led me to online dating. It can be hard for a girl who's interested in girls to find people online. I never had much experience before, or much faith in the system itself, and when I tried all those years ago, I got no results. So that left me bitter and with very little optimism. However, whilst on there, I was talking to a number of people. Not all of them was I interested in. Some of them I saw as only friends for the time being. There was this one really nice girl called Carol. She and I would always chat until it became a regular thing. I was excited and asked to meet her. Apparently we didn't live too far away. There was a city in between both of us that was roughly equidistant, and we could meet there one Saturday afternoon, I suggested. She said that she would, and so that Saturday I got all dressed up and made my way there. It was about a 45-minute drive, and I was getting butterflies in my tummy because I really liked this girl, and I hoped that she liked me too. I sat down in the restaurant parking lot, waiting for her Toyota Prius to arrive, but it never did. Getting frustrated and concerned, I resorted to messaging her via the app to see if everything was alright and that she hadn't had an accident. I didn't receive a reply and went home very disheartened. It wasn't until the next day in the evening did she send me a message. She told me that she had gotten into a horrific car crash and that she wouldn't be able to walk again. I was horrified. I'd met such a nice person for this horrific thing to befall her just because of me wanting to see her, and I felt incredibly guilty. She told me that she would be in touch, and I didn't hear from her for a few weeks. When she got back online, she told me that she had an excellent physiotherapist and that she was now back on her feet, despite her telling me before that the doctor said she would never be able to move again and that she was paralyzed. I tried to dismiss this and told myself that she was probably exaggerating before and that I should just let it go. After chatting for a few more days and making sure she felt comfortable, I even volunteered myself to go all the way over to her city and meet her there, maybe somewhere local for her, just to get her know her in person. She jumps at the offer and agrees, and so I start preparing myself for the date next weekend. That day rolls around, and this time I am very, very excited. We've spoken a lot more, and I genuinely feel like she's someone I can have a very strong connection with. I turn up at the cafe we'd agreed on and wait. I message her to check if she's coming and receive no response again. I wait a few more hours, and at this point I'm wondering if she didn't exist. This is getting too good to be true. The same as before, I get no reply, and the next day she tells me that as she was making her way she got a call from her mother, that her father had had a heart attack, so she had to rush back home 2 states away to make sure that he was okay. And although he suffered a minor stroke, he was fine. I was beginning to get uncomfortable now. I feel like she was lying to me, but I really was getting on fantastically. So for the final time I gave her the benefit of the doubt. We agreed, again, to meet one final time in the city in between ours. This time, I didn't doll up as much as before. I just kind of threw on some jeans and a top, didn't even apply that much makeup, and made my way casually, not wanting to arrive early in case disappointment. When I turn up, to no one's surprise, she isn't there. I don't receive a message, and unlike the other 2 times, something tragic and horrific didn't come through my letterbox during the next few days. I didn't message her. I was pissed, and the least she could have done if something had happened is send me a message for standing me up. I wait, and eventually I get a message on Facebook from someone I don't know called Patrick. He says that he really likes me and asks if I'm bi. I ask him who the hell he is and wonder why he's asking such a weird question. He then openly admits that he's been catfishing me the entire time. I get so angry. I type out the most horrific and obscene things. He played me. He messed with my time, messed with my emotions, and I thought I was having a real connection with someone. And it was all just a sick fantasy for him, in order for him to laugh at my expense. I wanted to report it to the police, but I don't think they do anything for this kind of stuff. I was deflated and didn't use online social media again. November 15th, 2015. I was already a few months into my deployment to Gotemba, Japan. We were supposed to be building a small parking lot for the local population, along with other various projects to strengthen our relationship with Japan in general. We had finished up a long day of working, and were going to take a truck back to the barracks. A group of my co-workers were planning to go out that night, and asked if I wanted to tag along. It was ramen night after all, so I couldn't say no. As the time to walk to the gate rolled around, we had a little safety brief about what to do and what not to do. But what caught my attention was the last thing that my LPO put out. Apparently there had been a rumor that there were a couple of local killings that were happening in the surrounding area, and the suspect was described as not having any facial features. That was the only thing that went through my mind when that bit of information was put out, because who would believe such utter nonsense from your typical LPO? Anyway, with that being said, a group of 4 individuals, myself included, headed down the hill, exited the gate, and began our trek down this big-ass hill. Leaving the base and going down the hill is like taking a trip from the past and going to the future. Further and further down you go, it starts to replicate Tokyo, from the occasional house, cemetery, pattern, to a full city of stores and restaurants ready to explore. But anyway, after we went to shops and stuffed ourselves with the best food we have ever had, it was time to go back, and we only had 30 minutes until curfew. There weren't any taxis around, and everyone seemed to be heading back home for the night. Then someone pointed out this old city bus that just by the grace of God happened to be going back up the hill in the same direction we were going. So we all hopped on and sat at the back, trying our best to not disturb the others. That's when it just happened. I looked out the window, and for what seemed like a good minute, time stood still. And by the next bus stop on the opposite side of the street is where I saw her. I thought I was going crazy. She had a long white dress and had long black hair that came down to her waist, but when she lifted her head up, there were no facial features at all. I nearly punched my friend in the arm and yelled for him to look out the window when I saw, and his face went pale. So we both went back down and tried to rationalize what we saw, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could explain it. Eventually we finally made it back to the gate and checked in before curfew ended, and finally went to sit down in the common area and talk about what we saw. But when my other two co-workers entered the room and asked what was going on, which then we pretended like nothing had happened at all, they asked, "Did you hear that lady say don't look out the window? Something about how she'll see you?" Man, I swear there are some crazy people in this world. That was the last thing I wanted to hear, because it only validated what we saw wasn't a dream and was real. I am now 25, in middle school, and I became best friends with a boy, James, and a girl, Dee. These kids were my lifeline in a dark time in my life, and I cannot stress enough how much I needed them then. I thought of them as my brother and sister. I thought we would be friends forever. We planned our lives on how we would buy a farmland with 3 houses and live our happy lives. But that wasn't in the cards. James and Dee had a big falling out the first year of high school. I remained friends with both, but James purposely distanced himself from me as high school progressed. James fell in love and married barely out of high school. Senior year 2012, Dee died a violent and premature death in a car crash, and it wrecked me. I mourned for years, memorized her in 2 tattoos, and felt/feel her presence in multiple ways, and feel as if I can call out to her and still reach her. And the song that we last listened to frequently on the radio is When I Think of Her. I dreamed a year or so back of seeing her again. I was 100% in this reality in the dream. I was shocked she wasn't dead, and she offered an excuse as to why she faked her death. We spoke throughout the dream and caught up on our jobs and lives. She was more mature, more slender, still had the same hair, braces gone, tattooed, now a woman like me, and not forever 17. But I woke up back to reality, and she was still 17 and in an urn. What happened to James shocked me. We were no longer friends, but we kept each other on social media after he added me very shortly before what was to happen. Last year, near Christmas, the healthy 24-year-old suffered his very first seizure and died that night. His young wife left a widow. It seemed to be a complete shock to everyone in his life. It turned out he had an undiagnosed heart condition. I felt immensely sad by his tragic passing, and lost life, but did not attend the funeral, as I felt it wasn't my place. I never felt James's presence, nor have I called out to him, but I did mourn him. The James everyone talks about on his Facebook page is a tall man with a deep voice and a goofy sense of humor. The James I knew was a little boy. The three of us did not feel so little at 12, but from my current perspective we were very little. The James I knew was a kind, hard-working and stand-up boy. Our first interaction before becoming friends in 7th grade was in 6th grade, with him scolding someone and defending me from another kid that was bullying me. Don't make fun of the new girl, then meeting me with a soft smile. He rode his bike 20 to 30 miles around the city of Phoenix to meet Dee and I while we were lazy and took the bus. Leaving my neighborhood to drive to work yesterday, I noticed a familiar bike with features I remember on his bike, like the bars on the back wheel, where his little brother would stand while holding his shoulders to hitch a ride. I think nothing of it, until I notice other features of the rider. A young kid, perhaps 13, with shaggy brown hair, around 3 inches from his shoulders, just like he had in middle school. A baseball cap like the three of us would wear, a baggy t-shirt and jeans like he would wear. And this kid looked at me for a solid second, though I had only moved and glanced at him, and observed that I could not see a figure on this rider that wasn't a childlike version of James. I turned out onto a main road, and he turned and began heading the same way. I got stuck at a light about 2 blocks down, and the kid was still riding in my direction. And at this moment, now he would ride up closer, and I would be able to get a look and see that it wasn't him. I had an intuition that if I looked away he would be gone. I directed my attention to the road and looked back in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, he was no longer visible. 70 years ago, my grandpa joined the army when he was 17. After he joined, he was relocated to Arequipa, which is a city in Peru, and he lived there with 2,000 others. There he lived in the army facilities divided into different blocks. One night, his rounds were changed, so he was dismissed very late at night. While walking back to his dorm, he decided to walk inside the building. When he walked along the hallway in his block, he noticed another person was walking in the opposite direction, and he said that he could not recognize this guy. So trying to get a conversation started, he said, "Good evening," but received no reply. Right there at that moment he felt scared. He had chills running down his back. Then he stopped and walked back to reach out to the man, and this turned back and he started to walk. So he crossed him once again and repeated, "Good evening," expecting an answer, but the guy stood there in front of him and started laughing, showing dark yellow teeth. My grandpa said that he yelled all caliber bad words, and while doing it he noticed the man thing running away, moving his arms like he was paddling, and disappeared into a wall. Then my grandpa fainted and was found by his friends. Weeks later he was called by his superiors and was told that many years ago there was an earthquake that destroyed the old facilities and ended some people's lives in there. Yet, they also told him that the person he saw was a cadet like him, who practiced rowing and passed during the earthquake. When I was 15, a friend and I went for a lot of walks around town. Small town, around 5,000 to 6,000 people. We're going to this cyber cafe to meet a few friends, and we often took different streets to get places, just to keep it interesting. We were about to go to the main street off one of the side streets, and a man on a bicycle approached us. He got off his bike and asked a couple of questions. Something didn't seem right about him. He was mid-40s, and we both kept inching away, but didn't want to come off as rude. So we answered about the weather or traffic. Then he paused, and we said we had to go, and he said, "You look so young. I don't want you to get in trouble, but I need to touch someone. I just need to touch you. You should come with me." I just felt terror overtake me. I couldn't speak. I grabbed my friend's hand and turned. We sprinted the rest of the way to the cafe, and as soon as we were inside, we used the phone. I called my mum to pick us up while my friend told the co-worker what happened and what the guy looked like. A month later, I received my first cell phone. There's an old hospital building on Pearl Harbor that holds offices. There's a 24-hour watch there. It's said to be pretty haunted. One night I was standing watch and I was moving the cameras around. I ran across what looked like a person standing near the fence. It looked weird and no one goes to that area of the base. So I tell Rover, who's my guy who walks around, to go there and see what the person's doing. Just moments before Rover enters the frame, the person seems to walk away, and he radioed back saying no one was in the area. My second experience is in the same building. I'm on watch again. It's storming, and this building has a tendency to flood. So I get a call from the building manager to go check on the basement for flooding. I'm tired of sitting, so I go downstairs with another person on watch, and as we were walking around, down, we both hear someone say, "Hey." I turn around and ask the person that I'm with, "What is it?" And he's staring at me white as a ghost. When he realizes it wasn't me who said hey, he just takes off. The building certainly has creepy vibes. I worked in a residential care facility, and for a number of years worked with a woman named Kajiri. She was generally okay to work with, but she could be intense. The sort of joking flirtation that often finds its way into high-pressure environments was common throughout the whole team. But when she directed it at me, it didn't seem so jokey. It took me forever to realize that, because I usually don't notice someone flirting with me until someone else points it out 6 months later. But when she started trying to give me jewelry and chocolate bouquets, I finally caught a clue. In between things being normal and actually maybe not really normal, there was a long escalation of text messages, comments that made me uncomfortable, personal space violations, dropping by my house uninvited, hanging around on my shift hours after hers had finished, and unwanted touching. As mentioned, I can be slow to catch on. Once I realized what was happening, I put as much distance between us as possible. I stopped answering calls and texts, locked down social media, and spoke to other colleagues and had them running interference. A lot of interference, actually. At the time, it kind of became a joke, but looking back, it was all kinds of messed up. She even parked outside my house sometimes, and I'd sit in the back room with the lights off so she'd think I wasn't home. Honestly, 2019 me is looking back at 2016 me, throwing popcorn and screaming, "Do something, you stupid cow." But hey, I was alarmingly chill back then. After a couple of months of my disappearing woman act, she seemed to get the hint and backed off. I was pleased. We all got on with our lives and lived happily ever after. Right? No. A few months after it died down, I heard through the grapevine that Kajiri seemed to have focused her attention on another co-worker, Linda. Linda and I had a close mutual friendship, but didn't know each other well. I didn't think much of it beyond, "Good luck, you poor girl." Few months later, and I get a call out of the blue from the mutual friend Linda and I share. Without preamble, he asked, Were you dating Kajiri? No. I was shocked. He had been privy to all the awkward details of my experience with Kajiri and had helped run interference. He explained that he had been talking to Linda and she'd asked about my relationship. The story that followed still sounds too fantastical to have actually happened in an actual sensible grown-up workplace. Kajiri had been catfishing her own best friend Amanda, posing as Linda. In a string of emails, Linda and Amanda had discussed Kajiri's drug problem, her abusive and dangerous sex, none other than yours truly, and Linda coming out to her family after her brother caught her in bed with Kajiri and more. The jig was up when Linda got a second job, coincidentally with Amanda's husband, who mentioned how great it was to finally meet Kajiri's girlfriend, which puzzled poor, straight, single Linda. Some highlights of the stories Kajiri had been telling to Linda, her friends, and other co-workers I wasn't close to, as she picked her audience very carefully. That Linda and I had physically fought at work over Kajiri, that 2 male co-workers, Kajiri and I, had an orgy in the staff office on a midnight shift, that Kajiri and I had broken up after I cheated on her with another male co-worker, and I was really getting around apparently, that I would drug her against her will, and that we had planned to have children using a donor, but that I had had a miscarriage. This woman had been living out a full-on soap opera and using her co-workers and friends as set pieces. Linda and I reported her to management, and she was immediately suspended pending investigation. She quit 2 days later. Unfortunately, HR decided they needed to continue their investigation of the allegation that I had an orgy at work, because that was totally plausible and not made up by a crazy woman, right? I left that job a month later myself, and when I interviewed for my current job, she had interviewed half-hour before me, and they were looking for 2 people. She didn't get the job, but there have been 2 openings since, and she has applied for both of them. I'm terrified of meeting her again. It turned out she has a history of inpatient psychiatric treatment for delusional behavior and was known to be obsessive about people she took a liking to. According to Facey, her current girlfriend, whether that be real or not, has a similar first name to me and shares more than a few physical similarities. She still knows where I live. My dad worked at base security for a US Navy shipyard in Scotland in the late 1980s. They would drive the perimeter of a huge open lot to stop people from climbing the fence. One night, they were driving along a narrow tunnel of fence line when they spotted something huge blocking the road. There was a machine engine in the middle of the road. He described it as the size of a small car, something they would have to use a crane and flatbed truck to move. Just totally unexplainable, especially since that section of the road leads nowhere and was locked by gates on both ends. And my dad and 2 other men would have spotted a truck or helicopter operating in the area, or the fact that the guard detachment had to check every hour. Me and my family live on a big farm out in the outskirts of a town. We often have friends come over and play games like Manhunt in the surrounding area. An important detail to note is that the farm is pretty much open. Anyone can waltz in, but most people don't, obviously, as it's private property. Well, one day we're playing Manhunt. It's about the middle of the day, and we're running around the place screaming. That's when we hear an unusual scream coming from the direction of the willow tree. We run over and get underneath its branches. that actually hides someone from being seen. My cousin, who is about 16, is screaming. There's a man who is literally chasing her. We all look around, and we see him stalking the edge of one of the fields. We start freaking out. My cousin says that she was hiding behind another tree, and he came up from behind her, put both his hands on his shoulders and said, "This isn't gonna hurt." And she just kicked and ran, but the man was persistent. She had no idea what his intentions were, but she didn't want to find out. We got inside, called the police, and when they arrived, he was gone. From that day forward, we looked into getting some serious security. Gates, cameras, it just wasn't worth the risk anymore. I've had a few scary stories told to me. NBK Bangor in Washington. There's a story that a long time ago, this little Native American girl was ended by men who owned this land before it was made into a base. The creepy thing is that her burial site is in the base, buried deep within the woods. When I was taking the classes to drive an armored vehicle, we had to do night drives on and off road, and we got very close to this site. The sergeant who was operating as my second set of eyes looks to the right side of the vehicle and told me to stop. It's pitch black. I can't see without the NVD, and I think the sergeant is just trying to mess with me. The two other vehicles stop behind us, and they get out asking what's up. The sergeant says he knows he saw something in the woods when we were driving. It was out of my line of sight, so I didn't see it, but my sergeant was really spooked. The vehicle behind us started talking about the girl and a Marine that ended his life 10 years or so ago. I'm not a believer in any of this, so I say let's just finish up because it's already 2 a.m. and we've got to go through this course the second time. I'm the passenger and the sergeant is in the back while a corpsman drives. I saw some stuff the entire time and said nothing. I asked around a little bit, and that's when I found out about the burial site. The thing is, what I saw looked like a small person, maybe 4 foot tall, at random clearings in the woods. Definitely not shadows. Definitely not the MVD malfunctioning. It was real. I've had other people go on this course and tell me they've experienced similar things as well. This happened before catfishing became a widely used term, though the act itself has been around as long as social media has. This was back during my freshman year of college, and it was during the Myspace era. In college, I made friends with someone in my honors colloquium class, Leslie, and she in turn introduced me to her other friends, who then became my friends. They'd all known each other for years, but were very welcoming to me, and I felt very much like a part of the group. That being said, I didn't really know them that well when this happened. What they did seemed, well, not like them. But then I realized I didn't exactly know what was like them. A member of the group, Catherine, was going away to school in Boston, and so the night before, we all decided to have a going away party of sorts. We were going to visit another friend, Tamara, who was going to school in Philadelphia, which was about an hour away, and then we were just going to have fun in the city. Our designated meeting place to drive down there was a Dunkin' Donuts. When I arrived, Leslie was there with our friends, Samantha and Anthony. Leslie looked pissed. She was sitting there with her arms crossed, staring at nothing, with an angry look plastered on her face. As for Samantha and Anthony, they kept looking at the door, and they seemed nervous and shifty. I could tell they were on edge. I sat down at the table of awkwardness since we had to wait on Catherine and a couple of other friends, and things got awkward when no one was talking. Finally, I just said it. "What's the deal with you three?" Leslie just replied, "You should ask them," gesturing to Anthony and Samantha. They suddenly looked guilty, but before they could answer, the door opened again, and they both went from looking guilty to anxious and mildly scared. I looked at the door and just saw a normal guy, pretty nondescript. When he walked in, he just kind of glanced around the room, like he was looking for someone. Anthony and Samantha wouldn't say anything. Leslie just kept huffing and shaking her head, and all three of them kept looking over at this guy as he sat down. As soon as Catherine and the others got there, it was like we couldn't get out of there fast enough. Catherine, our friends Evan and Julie and I were very confused. It was on the way to Philadelphia that we learned the truth. It was Leslie who told us. Apparently, Anthony and Samantha had created a fake Myspace account, and they'd been catfishing this guy Calvin. We didn't know the term catfishing yet, but that is what it was. They had created a fake account using a picture of an actress or a singer or something. I can't remember. Only her face was obscured. Apparently this had been going on for a couple of weeks, and the conversations had gotten serious. Like Calvin seemed to really like this fake girl they had created. I didn't know why they did this, and when I asked them, they didn't really have a reason. Mostly they were just bored. It turned out that they'd told him to meet at the Dunkin' Donuts at the time we were there. I think that once he showed up, Anthony and Samantha realized that this wasn't just a game, that Calvin was a real person with real feelings, and I do think they felt bad about what they had done. But it was too late. They couldn't take it back. There was no reason they had chosen Calvin. He was just some random guy they had picked. I guess Leslie had found out about it a few days before and told them to end it. And that was why she was so upset and angry with them, because they had told her what had happened, that Calvin was supposed to be there. After that, I never really saw Anthony and Samantha in the same way. These weren't really people I wanted to be friends with, especially when I saw the messages and saw how much they had gotten Calvin to like him. I thought this would be the end of it, but I was wrong. About a week later, everyone came to my house for pizza and just to hang out, and Samantha and Anthony told us they had gotten messages from Calvin. I didn't think much of it, because I already knew he had been messaging their fake accounts, wanting to know why she had stood him up, and he seemed upset, especially when this fake girl stopped replying. But no, that wasn't what Samantha and Anthony meant. He hadn't messaged the fake account. He had messaged their accounts. I remember them telling me that. My sharp intake of breath, the way my heart rate increased, that unnerved me. The messages were more of the same, but also Calvin made it clear he knew what they had done, and he seemed even angrier. Anthony in particular got a very long, furious message from him. I don't want to say that I thought they deserved it, but honestly they had done a shitty thing, and there were some consequences. And I figured it would die down in a few days. It didn't. A few days after Calvin had messaged Anthony and Samantha, he started messaging the rest of us who'd been drinking in the Dunkin' Donuts. Now this really scared me. Keep in mind that I was already dealing with my other stalker situation, so I was understandably on edge, and this guy had found me. I didn't know much about computers, but I thought he must have traced Anthony and Samantha's IP or something, since they'd used their own computers for the account. But when it came to the rest of us, we didn't understand. How had he found us? My theory is that once he found Anthony and Samantha, he looked through their friends and recognized us from pictures, but I can't say for sure. All of his messages came on Myspace, so at least he wasn't texting us and stuff. But still, his messages were very angry. He kept saying things like, "How could you do this to me? You made a fool out of me." I thought about replying, but Evan had done that already, telling Calvin that we weren't responsible, and he didn't believe him. Honestly, Evan totally sold Anthony and Samantha out, but we figured that Calvin already knew that they were the ringleaders. He just didn't know they were the sole perpetrators, instead thinking we all had a hand in it. I figured there was no point to defend myself, since Calvin didn't believe Evan when he had tried. This went on for a few weeks, and it seemed like Calvin was getting increasingly angrier the more we ignored him, because that's what he said we were doing. Finally, I had enough. I replied and told him again that we weren't responsible, corroborating Evan's story. I didn't actually put all the blame on Anthony and Samantha, but I told Calvin that it was just a couple of people in the group. Then I apologized, although that only made him angrier. He didn't believe anything we said, so I blocked him. We all did, but he just kept making new accounts. In 2 weeks, he probably made 3 different profiles, in addition to the one he had at the beginning. When I finally defended myself, Calvin messaged me back and said, "You made me into a fool, an idiot, and one day you'll know how that feels." I think you will. Maybe it was because of everything else that had happened with this guy, but that sounded like a threat, like he was going to personally make sure we knew how we had made him feel. We were lucky. As far as I know, Calvin never did do anything beyond message us aggressively, and it could have been a lot worse. He eventually did stop, and then he deleted his account. I felt bad for the guy, and Anthony and Samantha had been wrong. But what Calvin was doing to us was wrong too, the harassment. Eventually he stopped though after a few months, and we never saw him again. I slowly drifted apart from the group, first Anthony and Samantha for obvious reasons, then Catherine, Julie, Evan and Leslie. I wasn't too broken up about the first two because they weren't the kind of people I really wanted to be friends with. Not only had they done shitty things, they'd brought Calvin into our lives, and it was like opening a door and inviting someone in. In 2005, I hit Okinawa, Japan's shores at the ripe age of 19. I've never had an experience or reason to believe in paranormal stories, but for the next 2 years all was well, drinking, smoking, and generally having a good time. In 2006 I sustained an eye injury in Fallujah, Iraq, that put me out of commission. Every Marine is a rifleman, and as I could no longer shoot, they made me a barracks manager as my unit was deployed yet again. I was pumped for this job, as I didn't want to be discharged before my 4 years was up. That, and everyone knew it was a skate job, aka super easy. I had the usual problems of broken furniture and such for a while, and one day a Marine comes into my office and tells me there's a woman with a white dress with long black hair that covers her face who sits up in the upper corner of the room and watches him as he sleeps. I think to myself, this man has watched The Ring too many times, and I tell him that I can't change his room and to move on from it. At this point in time, I'm manager of Barrack 5696, and there came a time where Barracks 5704 diagonal from us was empty, and we needed renovations. I was in charge of moving everyone to 5704 so they could begin renovations. After all had been moved and everything was calm, I began an addiction to watch shows like Ghost Adventures and Ghost Hunters, back when they were fresh and new. I thought to myself, this is all rubbish, and found myself verbally saying such out loud. And a buddy of mine said, "Hey man, don't you have the keys for 5696? He was right. I did, and it was totally empty. At night. Piquing my interest, I bought a tape recorder, old school, not a digital recorder, and went to the room that the Marine told me about nearly a year back, and set the thing on the top of the mirror above the sink, locked the door and left. The only entrance to barrack 5696 was that one, and I went back to 5704. The next day I let the Japanese painters in to do their job, as I did every day, and went up to room 423 to collect the recorder off the top of the mirror. I returned back to my office 5704 and listened to the tape. I spent 4 hours listening to nothing, dead space. Then it happened. The wall locker in a room next to or near room 423 began slamming shut. Open shut, open shut. And this went on for a few minutes. It seemed the building had come alive. I was disturbed as I was the only individual with a key on them. Any enlisted, even above me, would either have to ask me for the key or get one made. Once they did, I cannot fathom them with wanting to slam wall lockers closed in the middle of the night, nor able to slam as many as I was hearing at the same time without 20 people there to help them. Yet I heard nothing but slamming wall lockers. No footsteps, no voices, no nothing. Knowing, I placed the recorder and told no one about it, locked the door to the room, and the main door to the barracks creeped me out. No one had access to this barracks, nor knew of my intentions. I was convinced the ghost realm was real. Just like Zach, I wanted to find out what was out there. I wanted more proof of these spirits. Barracks 5696 was still under renovations, which meant it was an empty night, as no Japanese working crews, and I held the only key. I convinced a buddy of mine, who I will refer to as Gary, to come with me. We were going to conduct a live ghost hunting session. As exciting as it sounds, it wasn't. We never heard or saw anything. Being my/his first time, we felt we were talking to empty rooms of nothingness, and we felt like nothing was there. We would pick random rooms throughout the barracks, opening whichever room we felt at the time, and walk down to the office of 5696. It still had power and the office was functional, and we joked that there wasn't anything there. The banging wall lockers still haunted my thoughts, and I aimed to know more. I plugged in my digital recorder, an upgrade from the tape one, into the PC, and started the exhausting journey of reviewing our files, one for each room. Gary was convinced that we entered rooms 3 or 4 times on the recordings when it happened. I said the usual, "Good evening, my name's Will," and Gary asked for their names. Clear as day, we got a response that said, "Get out." Neither of our voices, and we were within arm's reach of each other. This was the first time of many threats I received attempting to find the truth inside the barracks, a truth that came to infest my home life and made me never want to mess with this again. Of course, as a madman, I persisted. The story continued. I was living off base at the time with a girlfriend in a 10-story building. We were on the 10th floor, and everything seemed fine when we moved in. At least she never mentioned anything at this point. After a few weeks of doing EVPs nightly at 5696, she started to talk about this shadow person. I asked her where she saw it. Was there anything about it other than shadow? Was it threatening, or the usual stuff? She said it always walked in the closet, had some color of glowing eyes, orange I believe, and just creeped her out in general, but never tried to harm her. After hearing this, I started to freak out. I was having some issues in 5696, and I never mentioned them to her, but it seems I may have brought some home. During this time frame, I started getting strange things on my EVPs, not the usual get out or hellos, but things that seemed far more intelligent and sinister. For instance, I always introduced myself. "Hello, good evening, my name is William. I only wish to communicate and mean you no harm besides my name." These entities should have known nothing else about me. I was getting responses from them, calling me by my childhood nickname, a name I hadn't used in years, and the other guys with me damn sure didn't know it. They once asked who my mother was, who your mother is. Now, this may not have been specifically aimed towards me, if it wasn't followed up by a whisper saying my mother's name, in a different voice from the first. I lost patches of hair from the back of my head that looked like 4 fingerprints in a pattern, suggesting something had grabbed the back of my head. Doctors said it was stress and gave me steroid shots, but the hair refused to grow back for 3 months. 3 months just so happened to be the same amount of time I grew concerned with the EVPs I was getting, and threw in the towel. I locked up 5696 one final time and never returned there after dark. The hair that grew back in those spots was pitch black, and I have blonde hair, and stayed that way for years. These days it's slightly lighter, probably from the sun exposure, but still not the same color it should be. Finally, I had a dream in the 10-story building right before I quit, and it was some kind of evil red creature laughing and prodding me whilst it tortured me. When I woke up and realized it was just a dream, I was relieved. Shortly after this dream of mine, which I never told anyone and my girlfriend had a similar version of, we went through a rough patch and I moved out of the apartment. She left shortly after, stating something was bothering our son in the middle of the night, something unseen. Today she is a minister and swears to me I brought something evil home all those years ago, and it has been following her for years. My fiancé and I are camping, as we've done many of times in a particular state park that we enjoy. Everything was normal. We made some dinner on the fire, stayed up a bit, and then let the fire die down and went to the tent to smoke. Despite listening to at least 100,000 of these Reddit stories, the woods never scared me. This night, though, was the night my brain decided that a reoccurring nightmare about someone walking around our tent would be a good idea. So, I'm going through these cycles of dreaming that I've woken up to footsteps around the tent, and try to wake up my fiancé. Fail, dream it again, and eventually wake up completely to realize there's nothing there, right? 3 or 4 rounds into this mess, and I wake up to the footsteps again. This time I realize I'm not dreaming. There are definitely footsteps. Then I hear a deep, low, throaty growl, and I'm nearly petrified. I manage to reach over and wake my fiancé, whispering quietly, "There's something outside our tent." He wakes up, and we continue to hear something walking around the tent, growling and snarling. We're wetting ourselves. We can't decide if it's something big, because by the vocalizations it sounds it, but I'm hoping the footsteps are just amplified, as they generally are in the woods. And maybe this is just a really aggressive squirrel in a trench coat or something. We're trying to peek out but can't see anything. The noise has moved to the edge of the site, and there's a lot of snarling and animals screaming, then silence. Then it's on the other side of the tent. It's making it really hard to decide what to do. We're both trying to be silent while gathering what little feeble weapons we have. Me and my pink canister of saber pepper gel, and him a few weapons that we brought to cut bits of rope and carry in case of emergencies. We don't even have the hatchet, because I let him pack while I was at work, which means we had about 85% of the important things we needed. I did this to myself. Clearly, we are doomed. There's some screaming going on along the edge of the site now. It sounds like every small animal in the northeastern United States is being skinned alive around our tent. I'm shaking like a leaf, no exaggeration, and I had to stand because the adrenaline pumping felt like I smoked a Bobby Brown's lifetime worth of crack. We still cannot pinpoint where this thing is, what it is, or catch any glimpses from our tent. We are definitely done for in the woods here. It's late in the season, and there's maybe one other occupied site, and we showed up too late to even check in. So no doubt, we're about to be a couple of unidentifiable mystery moles, and I'm losing my mind because I have a kid. Finally, it's been a few minutes since we heard any shrieks or growls. Last we heard, this thing sounded like it were a few sites away. And so we're gonna grab our wallets, leave the supplies, and get out of here. and make a run for the car. We zoom the hell out of there. It's 2 a.m. and we get some Slim Gins at a convenience store. We go home for the night, gear up in the morning with some high-power CO2 weapons, hatchets, knife, you name it, and we go back. We didn't find anything. We made friends with a troop of tubby trash pandas for the rest of the trip, and kind of always wondered if, perhaps it was actually just our 3 raccoons in a trench coat terrorizing us that night. I'll never know, and it's better that way. Camp Dragoon in Iraq had weird things happen in different places. The camp was an old Saddam regime secret police complex, so plenty of people disappeared there, just to add to horrific background. The underground tunnel had torture chambers that had been walled off early, but people who went down there reported feelings of being watched. I took pictures in an old prison, and weird balls of light showed up when I got them developed by the locals. I chalked that up to dust in the air. The one that happened over and over though was lights in the buildings where they shouldn't be. I was part of the quick reaction force for the camp and was called out too many times to recall to look for intruders. We had apartment buildings on our camp, unused but off limits, and at least once a month guard towers, the Tactical Operations Center, or random people would report faint lights moving within. Every time we got spun up and cleared the whole building, but not even the dust had been disturbed. People tired, reflections, soldiers banging and being sneaky. I don't know, but it was weird and unexplained. I also heard a story that one night a vehicle, its white lights on, which is a big no-no, drove off to a new position claiming they kept hearing things moving around them, but never could see anything. They said that over radio, so either they just really hated that position at the time or something weird was going on. Something about staring into the dark for hours has a way of playing tricks with your head though. 4 years ago, I met this girl called Carrie. We actually met online, and we had a mutual friend called Fred. I used to live with an abusive family, so I had to run away to live with Fred. And I happened to have a crush on Fred. And then I discovered that Carrie happens to have a crush on him too. All 3 of us were talking normally, until Carrie introduced us to her psychiatrist, Enzo. Whenever we used to talk to her, she was always depressed and wanted to kill herself. And Enzo diagnosed her with schizophrenia, or schizoaffective disorder. Like once she wanted to throw herself from the window, or the time she went insane and hysterically crying and Enzo had to tranquilize her. There is always something wrong with her, and because we were her family, we wanted to help her, and she also told us about her breast cancer that happened because of her depression. One of the moments she wanted to kill herself is when she was hospitalized for her heart condition. Something happened, and then we hear from Enzo, who was visiting her at the time, that she actually jumped from the 3rd floor of the hospital. She'd broken ribs and a twisted shoulder, and was discharged 4 or 5 days later, without getting admitted to a psychiatric for her suicide attempt. Actually, a lot of times we hear from Enzo that he's going to admit her from a psychiatric hospital, but he didn't. A few months later, she stabbed herself because I told her to improve or else she is no longer my friend. She tells me that she can't, and I tell her that it was nice knowing her, and then we get a message from Enzo that Carrie actually stabbed herself and that she is rushed to the hospital because she lost a lot of blood. She needed a blood transfusion, and Enzo was her donor because there wasn't enough blood in the blood bank. After 2 days, she was discharged, again without getting admitted to psychiatric care. A few weeks after the incident, we told us to show her her scar. She refused and said that there weren't any. Every time when we went to speak to her, we had to be very careful on what to say, or else she'll go nuts, especially regarding her hallucinations. The thing is, We didn't discover this for almost a year, that Enzo was actually Carrie the entire time. She didn't jump from the hospital window, nor had she stabbed herself. She never even had breast cancer and never had schizophrenia either. And what was her excuse? I just wanted to express myself through Enzo that I couldn't as Carrie. We caught her when Enzo actually told us that he wanted to kill her, and that Carrie was his lab rat, and that he was done with her. We seriously found that so fishy, so we googled his full name and found nothing. We even went to ask people from the same country she lived in about the list of psychiatrists there, and we found nothing. And she also went on to create at least 5 to 6 more other people. She went back to tell her friends about us, ditching her for catfishing. Her friends went to attack us, and apparently she slept with Fred and got pregnant, even though she told him that she was on birth control. And she had to abort it, and now her friends are blaming her for making her abort it. They also went on attacking me, calling me a goat because I carry an Arab nationality. And they even threatened to tell my family about my whereabouts. And I also got attacked for lying about my age. That's what jealousy does to people, to the point where they catfish and manipulate others. When I was in Vilseck, Germany, the Rose Barracks, as part of the 1st Infantry Division, I had an interesting run. This was about the year 2001, and not long after a long deployment at Kosovo. I was an E4, about to be promoted to sergeant, and had a fellow NCO who named his Humvee Area 51. He told me he'd been stationed there for a while as part of a security team made up of Army and Air Force, and he told me lots of bizarre stories about things he saw and rumors. He then introduced me to a website called The Black Vault. The website is still around, but it's far less conspiracy driven these days. The site contained a lot of conspiracy theory stuff, Freedom of Information Act material, lots about the UFO projects like Project Blue Book. With hindsight, it's probably a bad idea to look all this stuff up on a government computer at work. He and I both had a series of encounters with military intelligence and even an actual CIA spook over the next year. They went through my living quarters while I was at work, trailed us, and a year later I relocated to the National Guard in Texas and it all ended. But it was a strange amount of attention to receive about a subject that's nonsense to our government. I was in a mall in Indonesia, and 2 tourists seemed to be having problems communicating with the cashier at a bookstore, so I helped translate. They wanted to buy me drinks to thank me. I told them it wasn't necessary, as I had to go back to my mum soon. They told me to meet them for dinner, and I told them I have to have dinner at home. They told me to sneak out and meet them after dinner. At this point, a bookstore staff noticed something was wrong and went up to question them. My sister and I dashed off while we were distracted. We continued wandering around the mall and realized they were following us, and to see if we were just paranoid, we ducked into a lingerie store since we figured 2 men wouldn't usually need to go into one of these places, and they followed us in. We ran so quickly back to the jewelry store our mum was at. The store, thankfully, had intimidating security guards, and I guess that stopped these guys. For context, I was 11, and my sister was 10. I've been in the Navy for 4 years. I'm operational on my first ship. I've been underway a few times. I'm medical on the ship, and I, besides the other people, have my own group of friends I hang out with. A couple of machinist mates, and a few other cooks. They're a little dumb, but they're cool. Well, after being underway for 3 weeks, we were pulling back into our home port and doing line handling, rigging the ship to the pier. And for those people who think the Navy isn't dangerous, people perish all the time, and this is one of the problems. One of my cook friends was doing the line handling and had a line snap back. These nylon lines snap back at the speed of a bullet and will rip through anything. Except it snapped where the men were standing, and Gary, the cook, was the only one hurt somehow. I didn't see it happen. Gary lost both his legs. The line somehow ripped them off. Me and another dog tried to save him, but he succumbed to his wounds. I still beat the living crap out of myself every day for it. But a few months later we went underway again. It was about 6 days into it, and I had watch. It was between midnight to 6 a.m, and I was tired as hell walking back to my berthing, and had my first weird occurrence. Every time I walked, something was ahead of me, like I heard footsteps on the metal floor. That in itself wasn't weird, but I was curious who was there, so I tried walking faster, and the footsteps matched my pace. I did a test and stopped moving, and it went quiet. I walked again and it started again, so I tried to ignore it. The second thing was the next night. I was up late until about midnight, as the ship life means you work 12-hour workdays if you're lucky, and I was going to sleep, but kept waking up because someone was walking past my bed out loud. It didn't wake anyone else up, I suppose, because no one else knew when I'd spoken about it. But I tried peeking my head out to see who it was a few times. Once when they walked past, and once when I heard them coming up. Every time I did, it stopped, like no one was there, like I imagined it. I talked to people and they're just like, maybe it's someone from a different berthing, or maybe it was an officer. I have no idea why someone would stay up, or skip their duty risking getting a major ass chewing just to walk a berthing, or why an officer would even go near our berthing. The most likely thing I heard was it was someone on watch, maybe, but no one in their boots sounded like this. It wasn't heavy sounding, it just sounded different. That's what kept me up. About 2 weeks in, there was a guy on watch topside. He started a man overboard alarm and we all had to muster, but literally everyone was accounted for. When someone falls off the ship, they make everyone get together and see if they have everyone to see who is missing. But everyone was there. They didn't find anyone in the water, and the guy on watch got captain's mast, and I talked to him. He claims he saw someone in uniform sprint and jump off the ship. Before that, he said he was just staring into the dark area and could barely make him out. Personally, I'm surprised he could see anything, because it gets almost pitch black out, and before he could really call out to him, he ran off and jumped. Very creepy. Back in 2013, I was living with my ex at the time, who lived near a nice country village, and I was in between jobs at the time. I picked up a job at a local garden centre. It was casual retail work, fairly decent pay, and easygoing enough that I could take coffee breaks frequently and wear basically whatever I liked, as long as I wore my work polo shirt. I was working distance from my ex's house, and full of people of all ages who were the most lovely people I'd ever met. Most of the regular customers who came into the garden centre were usually sweet old people who would visit the cafe because we had free teas and discounted lunches for old age pensioners if they had a store card. You could often get to know all of them, and some of them we even gave nicknames to. Most of them were like Pink Hair Lady, who was a badass 80-year-old grandma who wore a tasseled leather jacket who had bright pink hair. Then there was the campervan couple, who used to drive a really cool campervan with bright orange flowers painted on it. You get the idea. Creepy artist man though. He gave most of the young girls weird vibes. He wore a straw hat, was in his late 40s, and had round gold trimmed glasses, and would wear strange graphic shirts with naked women, or Professional Pussy Patrol written on them. He always wore ripped jeans where his knees were always hanging out of them, which were perpetually dirty with paint or mud. He had this strange half smile that would never leave his face, and a kind of leer that made people uncomfortable. He would take off his glasses and clean them constantly, which made you feel like he was trying to get a better look at the girls who worked there, especially the younger ones. Anyway, it was a roasting hot summer's day, and I had gratefully accepted the job of watering the hanging baskets outside, where I could avoid the humid, sweaty heat of the greenhouses. I was wearing black shorts and my red polo, as well as my tool belt to prune dead-head plants as I went. With the hose in my hand and sunglasses on my face, I was busy, but enjoying the solitary job at the quietest part of the garden center. Well, hello there. Out of practically nowhere, he slipped out behind some wooden trellises and looked me up and down, smiling with his weird, too small teeth. His eyes lingered on me for what felt like an uncomfortable few seconds, and I turned off my hose and asked him if he needed anything. He shook his head and kind of shrugged, still smirking at my legs. "Okay, sir. Have a nice day. Let me know if you need anything." And I continue and turn to carry on watering. "I've never seen you here. Are you new?" "Huh? Me? Oh, well, I've been here about 8 months now. I must have missed the memo that a beauty like you started. You have a nice tan. You look young." "Oh, thanks. I'm 23. Anyway, I have to get back to work." "Nice to meet you, Casey." I suddenly remembered my name badge and got slightly irritated that he knew my full name. I made a beeline for the smoking area where the tool shed was as an excuse to grab some smaller gardening gloves, and by the time I returned to the floor, fortunately, he had left. As the weeks went by, he would come into the store often, usually mid-afternoon coincidentally, or so I thought, as it was around the time I started my shift. Most of the time, I was the only cashier, so I would have to serve him. He would buy the most smallest, pointless things, like floristry wire or a tiny bag of birdseed. It seemed like he would make a purposeful purchase with the intention of interacting with me. He would make comments about my appearance, statements mostly like, "You have your hair different today. Yesterday you had it down. You have new glasses. That's a different lip color to yesterday." He would always announce my name loudly and deliberately during every interaction. I felt uncomfortable, but I was 23 and just politely shrugged it off. Around Christmas time, I was decorating the artificial trees, and he cornered me in the forest at the very back of the store. He jumped out from behind and made me jump, to which I was kind of pissed about him doing because I dropped a glass ornament and it shattered. He bent down and tried to help in grabbing my wrist and telling me not to touch the glass. His grip was scarily tight and forceful, and his hands were clammy and gross. I slipped my hand out of his grip and asked if I could assist him with anything. That's when things got weird. He pulled out a leaflet from his back pocket and told me he was an artist and had a Christmas art show happening at the local church hall, and he wanted me to go with him. He told me that he was a painter, and he thought that I would enjoy his work. I had never indicated any interest in art to him, or anyone else for that matter, which is why I thought this request in particular was a bit bizarre. I asked him if he wanted me to pin the leaflet to the local events board, and he reached out and touched my arm and said, "No, the invitation is specifically for you." He pointed his finger and jabbed it into my breast and said, "You." So I'm standing there in the dark corner of the store, obscured from view by artificial Christmas trees, and just kind of cornered by this guy who was touching me. I cringed away and said that I was busy with my boyfriend that day, and I kind of scampered away. I remember feeling really strange after that. The fact he grabbed my wrist and jabbed my finger into my chest the way he did. I told a few of my colleagues about it, and they all told me that they would warn me next time he was in the store, and that maybe I could just hang out in the storeroom until he left. Well, that memo must have missed a few of the temporary Christmas staff, because one day I get told by one of them, "Your friend is asking for you at the tills." It wasn't unusual for my friends to stop by, as it was a fairly popular place for gifts. So thinking it was maybe my ex's mother or something, I head to the till, and there he is. He's holding a piece of paper. I cringe, but he had seen me now, so I walk over and ask what he needs from me. He passed the paper over and asked me to open it. Folded up was a drawing of me, with exaggerated breasts and cartoon-like eyes, watering the hanging baskets in a very sexual kind of position. I kind of stood there and said thank you, but I couldn't keep it, as I thought it was inappropriate to take gifts from customers. I handed it back to him, and he kind of looked at me with this angry state. He turned around and left without another word. By this point, I'd had enough. I knocked on my manager's door and told him about the whole scenario that had just occurred, and all the previous interactions I had had with him over the past year. He watched the CCTV and agreed that it was so strange the way he gave me the gross picture, and told me he would talk to him if he ever came back. He praised me for my reaction to his advances, and said I was doing the right thing and he would try and see him off next time. The next day was a Sunday, and I was not due in at work. My boss calls me and tells me he just received a call from HQ, stating that an anonymous caller had called in to report a member of staff inappropriately coming onto a customer. The staff member they had described and named was me. The caller had said that I had been inappropriate towards him at work, offered to sleep with him, and had led him on, and obviously been promiscuous, and that I had been pursuing him for over a year. The jerk even described a fictitious relationship we had, and ranted loudly about how I had been cheating on my boyfriend before hanging up. HQ luckily didn't believe a word, as my manager had already mentioned the guy to one of the higher-ups, but they thought it was wise to let me know about this crazy guy, and suggest that I report it into the police. The next day I did just that. The officer I spoke to said that he matched the description of a man who was a local pest, someone who often harasses young girls in the local area, and was also known to stalk girls in his car, and had attempted to abduct a young woman not 4 years ago. The police officers assured me they would file a report and talk to him officially, and that he was not allowed in the garden center or anywhere near me again, and if he did, I was to call the police and he would be arrested. Unfortunately though, it never stopped him sending a ranting letter to my workplace, addressed it to me, saying he would kill himself if I didn't take him back, and receive the gift he drew for me. Fortunately, the police saw this as an unsolicited contact, and he was thankfully arrested.
At Sandhill, we had a demon in our bay. We had some sort of ritual scene take place in our bay one night while we were sleeping. Our fire guard woke up the entire bay at roughly 1 a.m. and screaming at our PG over the incident. According to the guys on fire guard, the one on the first bunk to the left of the fire guard's desk, both of the dudes top and bottom came off their bunks, fell to their knees and started making hushed whisper noises like they were praying. then every other bunk after them, faced back towards the latrine. When everyone had faced, the whispering prayers got a little bit louder, and Fireguard decided to flip on the lights and start screaming. I wasn't there, however, because I was doing my battle buddy and I'm laundry. So I only saw the aftermath of the Fireguard halfway to tears, and they were pretty solid dudes. But I had my doubts it was a real thing, until fast forward to about a week later, and I see that thing. I truly believe this was a demon. In our platoon alone, we had 5 guys attempt to take their lives, and one had a very serious chance of succeeding. If we hadn't have come up the stairs in time. The guy tried to do it on the balcony with his belt, but we cut him down. His neck turned out to be broken. So that night I came back up to grab my battle laundry, and we trade off doing each other's, and I'm about to wet myself in the kill zone, which is shaded by a massive locker and weapon racks, and there's this huge dark mass that almost looks like a female figure, darker than cave darkness, and there seems to be appendages or something swirling around it. It was just slowly moving towards the bunks on the other side, and I looked to the Fireguard, and they were out cold. Everyone was. I simply closed the door from the stairwell to the bay and got out of there. It's easily one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen, and it still fills me with fear and sends shivers down my spine. I would later see this same disturbing creature walking swiftly past the drill sergeant's office and down the stairs later on in basic. Throughout my life, a lot of strange things have happened to me, and I'm hoping that by sharing these stories, some of you might be able to spread some light on what I've seen. When I was about 13 years old, I had a small room and the setup was pretty cramped. My closet wall was about 1.5 feet across from the edge of my bed where my head lay. On that wall was a poster-sized frame of a guardian angel on a bridge with 2 kids. My family is Catholic and Hispanic, you see. One night, I happened to wake up in the middle of the night and looked at that wall to see the picture was no longer in its place. I looked down and didn't see it on the floor directly below either. Instead, the pictures were directly under my bed, with the image face up and the glass broken on the top of the image. From what I assumed, there's no way the picture could have fallen and ended up like that. Anyone have any ideas? As a younger child, I had been quite mischievous and typically got in trouble for messing things up or doing things that my parents specifically told me not to do. There was an incident where I had found myself in trouble, and when my mother was scolding me, she had angrily asked, "Why would you do this? What made you do this?" And for some reason the 10-year-old me just spouted out, "The devil made me do it." But I don't really remember why I would have said that. As a teen, I spent a lot of time in my room on my computer, and my room was my comfortable place. My nephew, who was around 5 at the time, also liked to play on my computer. There was a time when he came running out of my room scared and yelling about a monster. So I walked into my room to check for said monster and assured him there was nothing there. He returned to the computer and only lasted about 5 minutes before running out crying and yelling again about the monster. I still am unsure as to what happened there. Since I was raised in a Hispanic Catholic family, my mother hung up many religious images like crosses and statues all over our house. There was a small porcelain statue of a young Jesus that was set in place on a wall in my room. One day I was dusting off all the furniture in my room, including the porcelain statue, which stood about 7 inches tall, and it fell to the carpet as I was wiping off the dust. When it fell a grand total of 3 feet, the statue broke in a fairly straight line across the statue's neck, essentially decapitating it, on soft carpet. Nothing else broke off but the head. Brushing it off as no big deal, I used some clear nail polish to reattach the head and put it back on my wall. I didn't think much of it back then, but as I've grown older, it does make me wonder why only the head fell off. Right after high school, I left for the Navy. I figured it would be the best route to take since I wasn't committed to the idea of college right away. On my first command in Washington, D.C., I made friends with some of the cool kids and was invited to a going-away party for my roommate's boyfriend. I'm not the type to party or socialize in general, so I declined. But of course, I found myself surrounded by 3 large men, one of them being my roommate's boyfriend, demanding that I go to the party and that I didn't have a choice. I joked around that I was going to send an evil little elf, as it was Christmas, after my roommate's boyfriend for being so demanding and rude, and he laughed it off. That same night, my roommate told me next morning that my roommate's boyfriend woke up in the middle of the night with an ugly little man's face staring at him by the glow of the light of his Christmas trees in the barracks room. He woke up my roommate and was terrified. I'm still not sure why he would have seen anything, but he was very scared to pick on me again. The same roommate from the previous story was quite an abrasive person and typically rubbed the wrong way with people. We had gone through boot camp together, so I was used to her personality. She'd been having some trouble getting along with other people at our command ward, and was venting to me in our common room. She was slightly religious and asked to read me a Bible passage to explain how it was helping her through her rough time. I, despite my family, am not at all religious, but I'm always open to hear people out. I sat and listened as she began reading from her Bible, and within a few words I started coughing and choking, similar to when you start coughing on your own saliva. Out of nowhere she stopped and asked if I was okay, and I stopped choking and assured her that I was fine. Perhaps that was just strange timing. Also, when I watch movies including possessions or exorcism scenes, I tend to feel ill, hot, and get a headache, but once the film is over, it subsides and I'm fine again. It was such an issue that my now ex-husband used to try and stop me from watching these movies to avoid feeling ill. But I love Halloween and horror movies, so I didn't care. No matter what it was, these movies had some weird effect on me. I just always had these strange things happen to me, and no one could ever give me an explanation as to what they could have been. Even my parents have told me strange things before, like saying they had to cleanse my room with sage because something was in there. Also, when they were giving me sage to cleanse a new house I had moved into with my family, they double-bagged the sage and told me not to touch it with my bare hands, because I would ruin the sage. Mind you, they didn't mean that no one could touch the sage, just me. So that's my collection of spooky stories. I'm interested to hear any theories anyone might have as to what this could be. A good friend of mine from WI that I met in boot camp for the Navy came out of school with me in California for a few years. We started experimenting with psychedelics while freshmen, and in the dorms had a mutual paranormal experience. My old university is built from the skeleton of an old army base that was a really big base for artillery and such, down in the Clinton era. Everyone jokes the dorms were haunted because they were repurposed military barracks. We also had dilapidated, run-down old admin and hospital buildings around the campus that all intoxicated college students would explore as a sort of rite of passage. So one day we took a good amount of acid and had a grand old time. As we were peaking, we decided to lock ourselves in our windowless bathroom and put our headphones in and just jam to music. It was so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, let alone each other across the bathroom. All of a sudden the room expands in size, and it's like I'm in a very large square room with benches on all sides. On these benches are shadowy people of various shapes, sizes, genders, and ages. The problem is that they're all angry, sad, and hurting, and not pleased that I can see them. I got really uncomfortable quite fast and almost had to leave, but dead ahead was one shadowy figure that didn't seem to mind my presence. He was actually very calming and soothing, despite being made out of blackness. I could still make out the edges and some details of his silhouette. He looked like an average-sized man in full dress uniform for the army. He didn't speak to me per se, but he helped me understand the circumstances and resume my endorsement of a pretty intense and vivid trip. I decided not to mention it to anyone, as I figured it was just what we took doing its thing. The next morning, we met up with another friend of ours that was babysitting us to discuss the trip, and he commented that after we left the bathroom we were pretty quiet for the rest of the night, and didn't say much. Then we went back to bed. My friend cautiously asked me if I felt weird that morning, or if I had any initials stuck in my head. I asked him to clarify, because when I woke up I couldn't stop thinking about the name Roy J. Miller. He seemed startled, and said that he had the initials RJM stuck in his head all morning. We looked to our friend, who said that neither of us had mentioned anything like that. A bit perplexed, we shared experiences. Apparently we both experienced a version of the same room, the shadow people, and the sharply dressed military man who soothed our frantic minds and emotional states. We looked it up, and in East Garrison of Fort Ord, the base our school was built on, and my dorm building was supposedly the East Garrison, there was a man there stationed named Roy James Miller, who went overseas to Vietnam in 1968 and passed while serving in the army. I saw a picture, and it looked about right from what I could remember. I couldn't believe it. I've told this story a few times, still not entirely sure I believe it myself, but I can't deny that it happened. And neither can my friends. I was a sailor in the Navy, who spent a lot of time out at sea, probably weeks and weeks at a time. One such of my jobs was being a lookout to spot boats, planes and things in the water, or air pretty much, and report it back to the ship. My lookout rotation could have me standing watch during the day or night, sometimes both, and it was during the night where I was pretty afraid, especially if you were at the back of the ship alone. For anyone who hasn't been out in the middle of the ocean in the middle of the night, you realize you see many more lights move in the sky than you ever would in a city. And on Navy ships, they like to have every little light on at night, so standing watch around 1 a.m. feels very alien sometimes. During the night, without a bright moon to help your vision, you may as well be on a different planet. There was this one time I saw a bright green color moving in the water slowly, and I didn't know what it was. My mind told me it must be a USO or something else. Eventually I was told it was just plankton, but it sure looked freaky to someone who was unaware of this. Another time me and another guy were standing watch together, and I decided to just look up during 2 a.m. and see what I think is coming across the midnight sky. I would see meteors streak across the sky, but a few times there would be bright lights moving slowly way out there, maybe a satellite, who knows. But I stared at it for a good 20 minutes, and approximately 15 of those slow-moving lights moved in different ways. Either way, they were a few times I saw for myself just how vast space is, and that there really is so much that we don't know and have yet to discover. I am a sleepwalker and talker. When I get stressed out, I tend to sleepwalk more, but it's a pretty solid thing that my family and roommates are aware of. I've always had bad dreams. I woke up in terror most nights and would scream in my sleep. The most recent bout of sleepwalking has been strange. When things happen, I don't really remember them. At the moment, I'm living with my parents and sister in my family home. So about 3 weeks ago, I apparently rushed out to my mum's as she left for work and slammed on her window. I thought she was stealing her own car. Then 4 days ago, I went into my mother's room and woke her up asking why she didn't have a nose. When I was younger, I remember an event. I did not think it was real, but last night I found out it was real. I'm from New Zealand, and we have the Maori culture. The weapon of a Maori male warrior is a patu. It's kind of like a clubbed-shaped bone or jade-carved handheld weapon. In my childhood, I distinctly remember walking out of my room and into the kitchen for a glass of water. As I rounded the corner, there was a Maori warrior, complete with flax skirt, full facial tattoos, and a patu, making the dominance gesture, which is poking your tongue out and making an oof sound. I froze and screamed and closed my eyes, and he was gone. I always thought that this was some kind of crazy dream or my sleepwalking delusion. Last night, me at 30 years of age, I got up and walked through my house into the kitchen, rounded the corner, and what did I see? The same warrior making faces and threatening me. I kind of froze, dropped my cup, and closed my eyes. When I opened them, he was not gone. He had in fact gotten closer to me, making very threatening sounds and looks. I sort of stifled a scream and backed up to the door to the hallway. I opened the door and slammed it and stood behind it. I woke up my sister, and she came out of her room and was yelling at me about making noise while she was asleep. I couldn't form a sentence. I just pointed to the door. She shoves me out the way and opens the door. And wouldn't you know it, the kitchen was empty. I don't know if I was sleepwalking or if the Maori warrior is part of the spiritual house I live in. When dreams become reality, it will always be scary. In June 2016, someone I hardly knew passed away, weirdly at 2 a.m, which was the time she was shot. I had a terribly strange feeling. I couldn't sleep or calm down. I had no idea who she was or anything. I'd only seen her once. The next day I found out she'd passed. I remember thinking, her name is so familiar, and her death suddenly affected me greatly. For a while after that, I saw her in my dreams. I heard some knocking at the door late at night, but no one was there. My dog looked at the door before the knocking ever happened, but there was no person or animals in sight. Now this is where it gets weird. I went for a jog at midnight to a Catholic school down my block where I pray at a statuette. I prayed for her and my normal prayer. I wanted to continue running, but my dog randomly started limping, so instead, I returned home and went into my yard. I was sitting there. No one moved. But my neighbor's outdoor light randomly turned on when I was thinking about her. The next day, I found out that someone was shot at 12:30 a.m. at the exact spot I would have been if I'd have continued my jog. This happened the day after she passed, when it was starting to greatly affect me. I had a dream I was at the location she was shot at, and I was looking for her in a panic. When I saw her, she was wearing the same outfit she passed in. I told her, "You need to get out of here. Someone is coming with a gun to kill you." She hugged me and said, "I know. Don't worry. Everything will be okay." I said, "How would everything be okay?" And I think she just said, "Don't worry. You'll see." But I can't remember that part clearly. This was so long ago, I can't remember every dream, but I just remembered this one. I woke up early one morning. I was half asleep on my bed, and I was worried about something I couldn't remember what. I remember, and I wasn't fully asleep, but my eyes were closing, and I remember she sat on my bed and placed her hands on my arm. She sang, "Just close your eyes. The sun is going down. You'll be alright. no one can hurt you. Come morning light, you and I will be safe and sound. If that song sounds familiar to you, it's because Taylor Swift sang it. The only weird part is that I'd never heard it before. That night, I was on YouTube and found a video of the girl who passed popped up. It was a cover of her singing that song, and the last dream I remember related back to that song. For some reason, I was worrying about the afterlife and what would happen. Before I went to sleep, I prayed for some sort of sign. In my dream, there was a bright light, and I heard someone sing, "And I know you'll take my hand and come to where I am, here where no one can hurt you. Here where no one can hurt you, and I know you'll see the light, and come to where I am." When I woke up, I searched those lyrics to see if it was maybe a song I heard her cover of Safe and Sound mentioned previously popped up, but those aren't the lyrics. I know this all sounds crazy, but it's true. Right after my love of my life girlfriend died in an accident, I experienced something I still can't explain. Literally one day after, I was laying in my bed on my back, with my head facing the Polaroid pictures of her that I still had hanging on my wall. I was just dozing off to sleep when I said in my own head, "Janine, I still love you. I miss you. I hope you're here." Right after that, I felt the end of my bed sink down by my right foot, like what happens when someone sits on your bed. Then I could feel what seemed like someone crawling on their hands and knees. I have a very big bed, and they were coming towards me. When whatever was in my bed with me reached me, I felt this weight on my chest like someone was laying on it, with their head right next to mine, just like how my girlfriend used to lay on me. All of this happened with my eyes closed, and I know I was half asleep. So it could have been a dream, but there was something so comforting about this presence, so calming, so soothing, like I'd never been more at peace in my life. Then my dad called me. As soon as the phone rang, the weight immediately lifted off my chest, and the feeling of immense relaxation was gone. That wasn't very long ago, a few months ago actually, so it's all very fresh in my mind. To this day, I still think she was saying goodbye to me, and I have not experienced anything like that day since. I hope I can experience that kind of universal peace again. My dad died almost 3 months ago. About 6 weeks after he passed, I had a dream that I was doing laundry and talking to my mum on the phone. I was in our old house that no longer exists, but I was the age I am now and was talking to my mum because I knew she was lonely without my dad there. So in the dream, she has to step away from the phone for a moment, and a few seconds later I hear rustling, and then my dad say, "Hey baby girl, how are you doing?" Still dreaming, I just lost it completely, sobbing and managed to choke out, "I'm okay." And his response was, "I just wanted to let you know that I love you and I miss you." And I responded that I loved him too and missed him too. That was it. A few days later, I finally tell my mum, because every time I thought about it I started crying, and she said that she also had a dream about my dad, and that she came home and he was just sitting on the couch. She sat beside him and laid her head on his lap, something she never did. It was complicated, but my dad was gay. However, he and my mum were best friends and continued living together even after they separated. My dream was just so incredibly vivid and raw. I understood he was gone, and I have no doubt he stopped by to check in on me. It still hurts, but I'm sure someday I'll be glad to have had this dream. Both of our dreams happening so close just felt like maybe he was checking in on us. My dad is the type of man to call bull on anything paranormal. He doesn't believe in ghosts, aliens, or anything of the sort. I tend to follow in his footsteps, and if it were anyone else, I probably wouldn't believe this story. My dad grew up in a poor, small community. My grandparents were incredibly respectful and friendly people, despite the poverty. They made friends with everyone in town and helped anyone that needed a hand. Along came a wealthy, but very lonely man, Bill, who moved in next door. Over time, Bill became very close to my family. He revealed that he was estranged from his children after they tried to steal large sums of money from him. He discovered his ex-wife had been having an affair since before they got married and was simply trying to take advantage of his wealth. Needless to say, the type of help this man needed was comfort, not food, not money. Bill was over for almost every meal, and my dad began to see him as an uncle. Just as my grandparents had learned of his family issues, he had noticed that my grandparents were also struggling financially. Since he despised his family, he wrote a will to give all of his assets to my family. Then, Bill passed away due to old age. As you may have expected, his children came around quickly after. They did not host a funeral service or even attend the service my grandparents funded. They were strictly in town for the inheritance. My grandparents desperately needed the cash and knew that the will entitled them to it. But there was one problem. The will was nowhere to be found. Bill hadn't told anyone where he'd left it, and the money would default to kin without it. After extensive searching, my grandparents were on the verge of giving up. The night before the final day to find the will, my dad had an eerie dream. In his dream, he woke up in bed. At the end of his bed stood Bill. Bill proceeded to speak to him and tell him exactly where the will had been left. He told my dad it was in a safe buried in the basement, in the back right-hand corner. He even led my dad to the spot, told him the combination to the safe, and showed him where it was. My dad woke up very startled and ran to tell my grandparents. With little time and nothing to lose, they checked out the spot in the basement. Sure enough, they dug in the right spot, and there was the safe. They entered the combination from the dream. The safe popped open, and the will sat inside. I often write off paranormal stories as lies, misremembered events, or something similar. I checked with all 4 of my uncles and my grandparents for their version of the story, and they all confirmed it. The first thing that several people asked was why someone would bury a will. This is typically something you don't hide. Although my dad never asked Bill directly, he speculates it was due to some mistrust in the banks. This story took place in the mid-70s, and Bill lived through the Depression. My father tells me that the safe contained more than just the will. In addition to a large sum of cash, it also contained contact information for the executor of the will and witnesses. Bill had moved from several states away, and his executor and witnesses were acquaintances from his home state. The people he chose for these roles cannot be beneficiaries of the will, and he didn't socialize with many people outside of my grandparents. Without that information, my grandparents didn't know who to contact about his death from his home estate. After Bill passed, the local court set out a date for recovering the will. Since Bill's local attorney didn't have a copy, they contacted Bill's bank to see if he had a safety deposit box and searched the house. Both proved fruitless, and neither the executor nor any of the witnesses had come forward. The deadline to recover the will was the following day, and that's when my dad's dream occurred. If the will had not been found, the court would have moved to intestacy proceedings. The court would then appoint an executor to distribute Bill's estate to his default heirs based on a state-defined formula. When my grandparents contacted the executors and witnesses, it was discovered that the executors also had a copy of the will and knew of the safe. The executor and witnesses vouched for the authenticity of the original will in the safe, but the legal battle continued. My grandparents didn't mention how the location of the safe was discovered, but they provided various evidence of the poor relationship between Bill and his kids. The kids claimed fraud, but after deliberating, the probate court ruled in my family's favor, and the will remained valid. I still find it odd that Bill would hide the will, but I think it is possible that it was put in the safe as a place to safeguard it, rather than to keep it hidden. Bill may have assumed that his executor would hear about his death right away and be able to provide the location of the safe and a copy of the will. Unfortunately, it took the opening of the safe to contact the executor. Another idea that my dad has is that the location and combination of the safe may have been told to him by Bill in the past, and it was just buried in his subconscious and he dreamt it. I must admit that was my initial thought as well. My dad told me that he never would have had such a serious conversation with an elderly neighbor. My dad was in high school at the time, so the conversations he had with Bill were light-hearted and appropriate for an elderly man speaking to a kid. The serious conversations, such as the one about Bill's kids, only took place between my grandparents and Bill. There is the possibility that my dad overheard a conversation between my grandparents and Bill, but then you'd expect my grandparents to at least remember that Bill had mentioned a safe. If my dad did put the location and combination of the safe from some distant conversation out of his subconscious at the last possible moment, well, what an incredible mind he has. I asked my dad just how much money my grandparents inherited from Bill, but he wasn't sure of the amount. After the probate court ruling, the kids didn't stick around long. They were apparently pretty wealthy themselves, and were half expecting to not receive any inheritance from their dad. They hadn't spoken in years, so I don't think they were surprised by the will. In fact, my grandparents mentioned that Bill told his kids they wouldn't be getting any of his money after they had tried to steal it from him. This is my mum's experience, not mine. My mum's brother died because a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him, causing a crash. The crash cut his jugular vein, and he died later on the way to the hospital due to excessive blood loss. My mum said a couple of weeks after her brother's funeral, she woke up in bed to him standing at the foot of it. At first, it was just this abnormal bright light. Then it took a human shape, then shifted into her brother. He looked at her and smiled and told her, "Louise, promise me you'll always be a good girl and never give up." My mum replied, "I promise." He said, "I love you," then faded back into this light and was gone like it never happened. When my mum tells me this story, she always said that it had to be some vivid dream she had. She's a huge skeptic, but I've always awed this in this story. If anyone's wondering, according to my mum, the drunk driver who killed her brother was only charged with a DUI. The guy continued to drive under a DUI suspended license and caused 6 other drunk driving accidents. If I remember correctly, he was the cause of death for 3 people, one of which being a little girl under age 5. The 6th incident killed him. I don't remember how though. How he got away with it for so long, I'll have no clue. My mum said he was the most hated in the town she lived in, and every time he got out of jail, he'd just do the same thing again. It's a shame that so many had to suffer because of his selfish actions. Last year in June, my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It was everywhere, even in her eyes. She was fading fast and said to my father, "I'm ready to go. I want to say goodbye to the kids." Panicked, he called his brother and my mother. My parents are separated, and explained to them what was happening, and to bring my cousins and myself there the next day. The next day we visited her in the hospital, spoke for a bit, though it was really hard. That was the last time I ever hugged her and told her how much she meant to me. She died the very next day. I was on the phone with my father when it happened. I could hear the flat line in the background before he swore, hanging up. They tried reviving her, but she wasn't coming back. She was gone. A couple of months later, after the funeral, I was content in my bed, dreaming I was at my aunt's house. But then it changed. I was on the phone talking to someone, but I could see them. It was Grandma. "Are you okay?" she asked me. "I'll see you next month." I woke up confused and told my mother about this. The next day at work on her lunch, my father called her. They were having a memorial to bury my grandparents' ashes in my grandpa's hometown the next month on their wedding anniversary. Here's where it gets even weirder and sadder. That day, as a final personal goodbye, I sang to them the song Southern Cross by Crosby, Stills and Nash, a song my parents sang to me when I was little, that my grandparents sang to me sometimes too. A few days later I was dreaming again, that I was reorganizing my bookshelves and my cell phone went off. I answered it, and it sounded like a party on the other end, and on the other end were Grandma and Grandpa together, telling me they were all right and that they were happy now. In the dream I started crying, and they started singing Southern Cross. They paused only once to ask me to sing with them. That was the last time I ever dreamt about them. When I woke up, I was crying the last of the song's words dying on my lips. I never told anyone except my mother about this. Turns out a few days prior, she'd seen a figure sitting on our couch. A big figure. We think it was Grandma. I like to think they still come and visit every now and then. My dad once told me that when his father passed away, he had put his ashes in the closet because he wasn't ready to spread them yet. Gramps wanted to be spread on our land by a big tree by the lake. My dad said that he must have waited too long because one night he was asleep and out of nowhere he woke up to the feeling of 2 icy hands around his ankles, and before he could freak about that part, those hands jerked his ass about halfway off the bottom of the bed. For some reason he immediately knew it was his father, assuming it was because he was so abusive to my dad when he was a child, and it seemed like something he would do, and he went to spread the ashes the next morning. Never had another issue, although they also don't have any more human ashes in the house, My father passed away in 2016, and I had been struggling with depression, other issues, my path in life, and trying to figure everything out for myself. I was 22, and probably the only person in my family that was mentally prepared for what had happened. I'm not really a religious person, and had no higher power to pray to, and no elders left in my line of life to ask for advice. One night, I was exhausted and completely drained of all my energy, so I decided to call it a night early and go to sleep. Exhausted, I don't remember going to sleep. I found myself waking in the hallway of his old house, right next to his room. This is the room I sleep in now. I swung the door open, and to my surprise, it wasn't my stuff around the room. It was his, but it was all different in some way, like it had been crafted perfectly. He was sitting on his bed watching an old Western movie, one I'd never seen, and I did my best to watch them all with him, so I wasn't sure how I didn't know this one. He was laughing and having a good time. The room was really bright. It hurt my eyes to look at everything. I was so confused. I did what I always did and went and sat across from him under his bedroom window. He always had an extra armchair for anyone who could come over and to have a conversation with him. All of my siblings' friends grew up in a rough spot, so everyone came to him for fatherly advice because he always knew just what to say. I stared at the TV trying to recognize the movie. I couldn't. I heard children laughing outside his window. I turned to look out, and I couldn't see anything. I was blinded by a radiant, warm white light. He stopped laughing and looked at me and said, "You can't see it, because it's not your time yet. But no, it's beautiful, kiddo." I broke down crying and asked him where I was and why I was with him. He said, "I brought you here because I know you're struggling, and you need to know for sure." He looked so different from when I'd seen him in his final days. He was warm, happy, and healthy. Healthy like I'd never seen him before in my life. Puzzled and sobbing, I looked at him and asked him, "What should I do with my life? What should I focus on?" He told me, "You need to focus on yourself and do right by your lonesome first." I understood, nodding at him. We talked for a bit about life, and then he looked away from his movie. "Why don't you get us something from the corner store like old times?" I wiped the snot from my nose and the tears from my face, and said I would be back with the junk I could carry. I happily jumped out and walked out of the room and into the doorway. He said, "Don't look back. Just keep walking forwards till you head outside, but make sure you close the door all the way." Confused, I did what was commanded, and shut his bedroom door and started walking down the hallway of his old place. Confused, I could still hear him talking, echoing through the hallway. "Keep walking, you'll make it back just fine." It was getting darker and darker as I reached the front door, excited for candy and junk food with my pops, just like when I was a kid. I sprung the front door open only to be blinded by the same white light I couldn't see. I immediately awoke, gasping for air and crying. I attempted to get out of bed and got tangled in the blankets and fell, still crying and freaked out by what had just happened. I quickly ran to the shower and took all my clothes off and hopped in and turned the hot water on. I was trying my best to compose myself and stop crying. My body was flush with emotions. I stayed in the shower for a while, trying to get a grip on everything. Eventually I got out and went back into my room, that was once his, to get dressed. Out of the corner of my eye I spotted his old radio. I never really listened to the radio much. I'd been a huge punk rock fan and kept my own genres. I decided to turn it on, and as soon as I did, Simple Man by Lynyrd Skynyrd came on, and I had never heard this song before that moment in time, and it messed me up royally. I instinctively started crying again once I heard the lyrics. My old man was finishing our talk through music, the kind of music he liked to listen to. Since that day, I've done my hardest and put myself out there in the thick of it. I've asked one of my friends out, and he said yes. We've been dating for a few months, and it's looking really good. I took up leather crafting as a hobby, and really enjoyed it. I also got a raise that's almost doubling my pay, and I get to relocate to a new city soon. Some place I've never been, and I've been listening to all kind of music I wouldn't have thought twice about listening to before, along with saving for a new hobby, the cello. Since then, I haven't questioned the spirit world. It exists. I was there. I know some people don't believe in gods, and I'm one of them. But I know what world exists, and it's one with our own. Last year, we had a student in my grade at high school die in a car accident with his mother. I'd never heard of him or met him. I didn't know until school the next day. That day, I woke up exactly an hour before my alarm, and I saw a shadow in front, blocking my digital alarm clock. I blinked and he was gone. Then in the hallway I heard a loud and very panicked, "Mummy?" School was silent, and they did an announcement explaining what had happened. I went out of class, sobbing, and I felt like it was affecting me, more than it should have, especially since I didn't know him. But when I told others about it a week later, as I didn't want to throw salt on an open wound, they didn't question me. I don't know if his spirit was going to different places searching for his mother's spirit, or if he only appeared to people who could be considered mediums. This happened to me a second time too, although it was before this. I had a cousin who lived in North Dakota, and it was blizzarding. He got in a car crash, and the other car that killed him was actually his brother. Of course, it wasn't intentional. Because of the blizzard, neither of them could really see. But it made the situation even more traumatic for my family. It had been literally years since his death. I had a very vivid dream of him in my mum's room, talking to her. He looked like he had aged, like the age he would have been had he not died. I was a little girl again, acting the way I always did to try and impress him. He told me he was there to babysit me, and I was so happy he was there. When I awoke, I cried, because the last thing I said to him all those years ago was that I hated him. I felt like he turned up to tell me that he forgave me. I told my mum, and she cried too. That day I had the dream was his brother's birthday. His brother just moved to the same state as me, and I'm convinced his spirit was coming down from North Dakota to go with his brother, and stopped by with me to tell me he forgave me. I grew up in a relatively small Midwest town, so when someone went missing, it was big news, and everyone would talk about it. A while back, a 13-year-old girl wound up missing, and it was all people were talking about for a few weeks. We were the same age, just went to different schools, so it hit close to home for me especially. A few days after her disappearance was in the news, I started having these vivid dreams, where I felt that I was living first person in this girl. I never saw what I looked like, I just knew I was her. I would always be in the same dream, where this couple that lived a couple of blocks away from my actual house would drive up and grab me as I was walking and shove me into their car. The dreams were extremely graphic, and I always ended up being thrown into a ditch about a mile away from the house. I would wake up screaming, and it even got to a point where I didn't even want to go to sleep, and would pull all-nighters because I was afraid of having the same dream again. The dreaming went on for maybe a week or two, and then it suddenly stopped. A few days after they stopped, the authorities found the missing girl's body, sadly. She was found in the same ditch I'd dreamt, exactly in the same spot, only a mile from my house. It still kind of creeps me out, and I kind of feel guilty for never telling the authorities about the couple in my dream, or about the ditch where the girl was found. But I genuinely thought they were just nightmares from all the talk in the town, and even after they found her, I didn't want to waste the authorities' time with speculation. I'm normally a pretty skeptical person, but I still can't explain this. From pretty much the first night after my dad passed away, I started seeing him in my dreams. I didn't think anything of it at first, because I figured that's a perfectly reasonable subconscious response to losing a loved one. The weird thing, though, was that he looked seriously real. Everything else in my dream would have that strange cartoonish vibe to it. Yet, I could look at my dad and count the individual hairs on his moustache and on his head. In one of the dreams, I became lucid and realized I was asleep. I asked my dad point blank, "Are you visiting me? Or is this just a figment of my imagination? I need to know." He smiled, hugged me and said, "I'm here with you right now, son, and I always will be. I love you." I woke up suddenly, and as I did, I saw a very light shadow. Had it not moved, I wouldn't have seen it. It was a head and shoulders leaning through the doorway and into my room. As soon as I saw it, it quickly moved away and backed out of the room. Somehow, it was calming rather than scary. It was absolutely amazing, because that's exactly what my dad used to do when I was little, when he left really early for work. He'd pop his head in and say goodbye. The way this shadow moved was exactly the same, and I'm convinced it was him checking in on me. If that wasn't strange enough, my mum called me downstairs that same morning. She tells me to go into the living room, and I look at the floor. I go in, and guess what? Dad's reading glasses had somehow ended up slap bang in the middle of the room. That 110% confirmed it for me. When I was younger, I had a lot of trouble sleeping, and would sleepwalk and have terrible night terrors. This happened for about 6 years of my early childhood. For a bit of context, my brothers all lived together in an apartment, or flat as we called them in England, which was only 2 floors and had about 6 people living in them. I don't remember exactly when it started, but I began having incredibly vivid dreams of dead people that were inside my house. From what I can remember, from my pea-sized brain, they wanted to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand. Many times, it would end up in a nightmare for me, and I would sleepwalk. However, I would run and scream up and down the halls like I was being chased by something. When I was awake, I wouldn't be able to walk down the hall by myself because of people I saw hiding inside of the rooms. It got to the point where my mum had a priest over to bless the home, and after a while I stopped seeing stuff, experiencing night terrors, and never slept-walked again. Turns out the apartment block was built on a graveyard.